The sanctuary of one's own driveway is supposed to be the final threshold of safety. It is the boundary line where the perils of the outside world are meant to recede, replaced by the warmth of familial bonds and the quiet comfort of home. But for 18-year-old Richard Brink, that boundary was not a line of defense. It was a killing floor. Imagine, if you will, the profound tranquility of a November night in Michigan. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the approaching winter. It is the kind of silence that feels heavy, a blanket covering the sleeping earth. But on this specific night, that silence was a deception. It was a veil hiding a predator who waited in the shadows, armed not just with a weapon, but with a malice so cold it would freeze the heart of a community for nearly 4 decades. This is not merely a story of a life extinguished too soon. It is a chronicle of a phantom who walked among the grieving for 37 years, shielding a dark secret behind a facade of normalcy. It is a narrative that asks a terrifying question. Do we ever truly know the history of the ground we walk upon, or the secrets harbored by those we pass in the street? Before we unravel the threads of this disquieting tapestry, kindly ensure you are subscribed, so you do not miss the moment when justice, however delayed, is finally dispensed. Park Township, situated near the charming enclave of Holland, Michigan, in 1987, was the very definition of an idyllic Midwestern community. It was a place deeply rooted in Dutch heritage, where the values of hard work, religious devotion, and neighborly trust were not merely slogans, but the foundation of daily existence. Residents left their doors unlocked. Bicycles were left on front lawns without fear of theft. It was a milieu where violence was an abstract concept, something that occurred in the distant, grimy alleys of Detroit or Chicago, not amidst the manicured lawns and tulip fields of Ottawa County. In this serene environment, Richard Brink, known to his friends and family as Rick, was carving out the beginning of his adult life. At 18 years of age, he stood on the precipice of his future, possessing that specific radiant optimism that only the young can claim. He was a graduate of West Ottawa High School, a young man who had successfully navigated the turbulent waters of adolescence and emerged with a steady job and a steady girl. He was employed at a local manufacturing plant, Donnelly Corporation, working the second shift. He was responsible. He was liked. He was, by all accounts, a young man without a single enemy in the world. However, a chilling detail, often overlooked in the analysis of such tragedies, is that innocence is not a shield. In the eyes of a predator, innocence is merely an opportunity. The date was November 7th, 1987, a Saturday. The weekend had brought a respite from the week's labors, and Rick had spent the evening in the company of his girlfriend. It was the quintessential portrait of teenage romance in America. They had perhaps driven along the lakeshore, the moonlight dancing on the dark waters of Lake Michigan, discussing plans for the holidays, or simply enjoying the comfortable silence of shared affection. There was no premonition of doom. There was no ominous music swelling in the background, only the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the radio playing the hits of the era. At approximately 11 o'clock in the evening, Rick dropped his girlfriend off at her residence. They exchanged their farewells, a ritual of "I will call you tomorrow" that lovers have performed for centuries. He watched her enter her home safely, a testament to his character, before turning his vehicle back towards his own parents' house on North 160th Avenue. The drive home was short. The roads were dark, illuminated only by the cones of his headlights cutting through the blackness. One can imagine his thoughts during that solitude. Perhaps he was thinking about his shift at work the next day. Perhaps he was replaying a conversation from earlier in the evening. He was unaware that these were the final minutes of his existence. He was unaware that the sands in his hourglass had not just run low, but had shattered completely. He pulled into the driveway of the home he shared with his parents. The house was dark, his family likely asleep or winding down for the night. He shifted the car into park. The engine idled. The headlights cast long, distorted shadows against the garage door. And then the sanctity of the night was torn asunder. Gunshots. Not the chaotic spray of a drive-by shooting, but the deliberate, methodical discharge of a firearm. 2 shots. Inside the residence, the sound registered with terrifying clarity. It was a noise that did not belong in Park Township. It was a violent intrusion that jolted Rick's sister and parents from their peace. His sister, startled by the pop-pop sound that echoed like a thunderclap in the yard, looked out the window. She saw Rick's car. It was sitting there, the engine still running, the lights still burning. But the vehicle was not moving towards the garage. It remained stationary, a steel coffin resting on the concrete. Ask yourself, would you have opened that door? Would you have rushed out into the darkness, driven by parental instinct? Or would you have been frozen by the primal fear that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong? Rick's father, a man of courage and concern, did not hesitate. He exited the home, stepping into the chilly November air. He approached the vehicle. The scene that greeted him was a tableau of horror that no parent should ever witness. His son, his boy, was slumped over the steering wheel. The vibrant life force that had animated him just moments ago had been extinguished. The window was shattered. The interior of the car, once a symbol of teenage freedom, was now a crime scene. The panic that ensued was raw and visceral. The call to the authorities was made, a frantic plea for help that was already too late. The constabulary descended upon the scene, their sirens wailing a discordant elegy in the night. Blue and red lights washed over the suburban lawn, painting the white siding of the house in the colors of emergency and distress. Detective Lieutenant Elmer Veldheer of the Ottawa County Sheriff's Department was among those who responded. In 1987, forensic science was in a different era. There were no immediate DNA databases to query, no high-definition surveillance cameras on every doorbell. It was an era of shoe leather, fingerprints, and ballistics. The investigators cordoned off the driveway. They photographed the shattered glass, the tire tracks, the tragic position of the victim. They began the grim task of canvassing the neighborhood. Lights flickered on in adjacent houses as neighbors, roused by the commotion, peered through their curtains, witnessing the destruction of their community's innocence. The word spread with the speed of a virus. Rick Brink has been shot. Rick Brink is dead. But here is where the narrative twists, defying the logic of a simple robbery or a crime of passion. The investigators found no weapon. They found no obvious motive. Rick's wallet was not taken. There was no evidence of a struggle outside the vehicle. It appeared to be an execution, a cold-blooded assassination of an 18-year-old factory worker. Why? The question hung in the air like smoke. Why Rick? He was not involved in narcotics. He was not a gambler. He was not involved in a love triangle. He was, by every metric available to law enforcement, a clean victim. And that, paradoxically, made the crime infinitely more terrifying. If a boy like Rick Brink could be murdered in his own driveway for no apparent reason, then who was safe? The investigation began in earnest. The sheriff's department poured resources into the case. They interviewed his friends, his coworkers at Donnelly Corporation, his girlfriend. They retraced his steps that night, looking for a shadow, a discrepancy, a single thread that, if pulled, would unravel the mystery. They looked for a Chekhov's gun, a detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later prove to be the key. Perhaps a car seen idling down the street? A strange comment made by a coworker? One detail did emerge, though its significance would not be fully understood for decades. A vehicle. A dark-colored vehicle had been spotted in the vicinity. It was a vague description, the kind that frustrates detectives more than it helps. In the 1980s, dark sedans were ubiquitous. It was a lead, but it was a needle in a stack of needles. The autopsy confirmed the brutality of the act. Rick had been shot with a large-caliber weapon. The medical examiner's report was a clinical document detailing the destruction of a human life, but it could not measure the devastation inflicted upon the Brink family. His parents were left with a void that could never be filled. They had to plan a funeral when they should have been planning for his future weddings or graduations. The community of Holland and Park Township reeled. The funeral was a somber affair, attended by hundreds. The sheer senselessness of the crime created a palpable atmosphere of fear. People began locking their doors. They looked at strangers with suspicion. The killer was out there. He was not a monster from a movie. He was potentially the man standing behind you in the grocery line, or the driver of the car next to you at the traffic light. As the weeks turned into months, the snow began to fall, covering the crime scene in a blanket of white. But the snow could not cleanse the stain of the murder. The investigators worked tirelessly. They followed up on hundreds of tips. They administered polygraph examinations to people in Rick's circle. Everyone was a suspect, and yet no one was a suspect. There is a specific kind of agony reserved for the families of cold case victims. It is a grief that is denied closure. It is a wound that is kept open by the constant knowing question of who and why. The Brink family endured this agony not for a year, not for a decade, but for a lifetime. They sat through holidays with an empty chair at the table. They watched Rick's friends grow up, get married, have children, and gray with age, while Rick remained forever 18, frozen in a photograph on the mantel. The constabulary exhausted every lead. The file on Richard Brink grew thick with reports, witness statements, and dead ends. It became a cold case, a term that sounds clinical, but feels like abandonment to those left behind. The box containing the evidence of his murder sat on a shelf, gathering dust, waiting for a technology that had not yet been invented to give it a voice. However, the universe has a way of keeping score. While the killer may have believed he had committed the perfect crime, he had left something behind. Something microscopic. Something that would wait patiently in the darkness of an evidence locker, enduring the passage of presidents, the rise of the internet, and the turning of the millennium. The killer resumed his life. He walked free. He breathed the air that Rick Brink was denied. He likely convinced himself that he had gotten away with it. He might have even forgotten the specific details of that night, allowing the memory to fade into the recesses of his mind. But he made a fatal miscalculation. He underestimated the relentless march of science. He did not foresee that the very blood in his veins, the genetic code that made him who he was, would eventually become the witness that would betray him. But before we leap to the resolution, we must understand the weight of the years that passed. We must walk the path of frustration trodden by the detectives who refused to let Rick's name be forgotten. Detectives who retired without solving the case, carrying the burden of failure into their golden years. In the year 2009, the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office formed a dedicated cold case team. They were retired detectives, men who had spent their lives chasing shadows, brought back to look at the cases that haunted the department. They dusted off the file labeled Richard Brink -1987. They looked at the crime scene photos with fresh eyes. They re-interviewed witnesses whose memories had faded with age. They found the case to be a labyrinth. There were rumors, of course. In a small town, rumors are the currency of the bored and the fearful. There were whispers of mistaken identity. Was the killer actually looking for someone else? Someone with a similar car? It was a plausible theory. Rick was so squeaky clean that it made more sense for him to be a mistake than a target. But theories do not secure convictions. Evidence does. And the evidence they had was silent. The gun was never found. The dark car was never identified. The motive remained as opaque as a frozen lake. The years continued to bleed into one another. 1997, 2007, 2017, 30 years, a generation. The world changed irrevocably. The Berlin Wall fell. The Twin Towers collapsed. Smartphones connected the globe. And yet, on North 160th Avenue, the ghost of Rick Brink still lingered, a silent sentinel demanding justice. It seemed that the phantom would win. It seemed that the secret would be taken to the grave. But then, a new tool emerged from the laboratories of geneticists, a tool originally designed to trace family trees, now repurposed to hunt monsters. Investigative Genetic Genealogy. This is where the story shifts from a tragedy of the past to a thriller of the present. This is where the strands of DNA, like the strings of a marionette, began to pull at the killer, drawing him out of the shadows and into the harsh light of judgment. But the path to him was not a straight line. It was a twisted road of distant cousins, family secrets, and a relentless pursuit of the truth. What if I told you that the key to solving this murder lay not in the immediate evidence found at the scene, but in a decision made by a distant relative of the killer to spit into a tube and mail it to a genealogy website? What if the sanctuary the killer had built for himself over 37 years was dismantled by a family tree? As we prepare to delve deeper into the investigation that finally cracked the code, ask yourself, how many people did you pass today whose secrets could shatter your reality? The earth of Park Township accepted Richard Brink not as a seed planted for the harvest, but as a stolen treasure buried before its time. The funeral was a procession of sorrow that wound its way through the heart of the community, a black ribbon of vehicles stretching under the gray November sky. Friends stood in huddles, their breath misting in the cold air, grappling with a mortality that felt alien to their youth. Parents held their children tighter, the phantom of the killer casting a long, invisible shadow over the ceremony. To bury a child is to violate the natural order of the universe. It is a sentence of perpetual torment for those left behind. For the investigators, the funeral marked not an end, but the beginning of a relentless and frustrating odyssey. Detective Lieutenant Elmer Veldheer and his team were men of logic and procedure, accustomed to the cause and effect nature of criminal justice. Usually, a murder is a puzzle with edges, a jealous lover, a drug debt, a sudden rage. But the Brink case was a sphere, smooth, featureless, offering no grip for their investigative fingers. They knocked on doors until their knuckles were bruised. They chased whispers that vanished like smoke in the wind. Consider the sheer volume of information that leads nowhere. In the weeks following the murder, the tip line rang with the chaotic energy of a frightened populace. A neighbor saw a shadow. A driver saw a car speeding. A bartender heard a strange comment. Each lead was a thread that the detectives were duty-bound to pull, hoping it would not unravel into nothingness. They tracked down the owners of dark sedans. They interviewed ex-boyfriends of Rick's girlfriend. They looked into the eyes of dozens of young men, searching for the flicker of guilt, but found only confusion and fear. The year 1987 bled into 1988. The snow melted, revealing the brown earth, but it did not reveal the weapon. The spring brought flowers to the Dutch heritage gardens of Holland, Michigan, but it brought no solace to the Brink household. Rick's room remained a shrine to a life interrupted, his clothes still in the closet, his scent slowly fading from the fabric, the silence of the space screaming louder than any scream he might have uttered that night. This is the phase of a cold case that is rarely depicted in cinema. It is not a montage of exciting chases and breakthroughs. It is the slow, grinding erosion of hope. It is the detective staring at a file at 2 o'clock in the morning, the coffee cold in his mug, realizing that the killer is likely sleeping soundly in a warm bed, perhaps only miles away. It is the realization that the system, designed to protect and serve, is failing. However, a chilling detail lay dormant within the evidence boxes, unnoticed by the naked eye. The killer, in his arrogance or his haste, had touched the vehicle. He had leaned in. He had existed in that space. In 1987, this contact was meaningless. DNA profiling was in its infancy, a tool for the future. barely understood by the average patrolman. But the constabulary, with a foresight that would prove to be prophetic, preserved everything. They swabbed the surfaces. They kept the glass. They stored the microscopic debris of the crime scene in a climate-controlled purgatory, waiting for science to catch up to their need for justice. The 90s arrived, bringing with them the digital revolution. The world accelerated. Information began to flow at the speed of light. Yet the file of Richard Brink remained static. It was a paper anchor in a digital ocean. The detectives who had originally worked the case began to retire. They handed in their badges and their service weapons, but they could not hand in the memories. They carried the image of Rick, slumped over that steering wheel, into their retirement. It became the story they told over beers, the one that got away, the failure that haunted the quiet moments of their lives. But the family? The family does not retire from grief. For Rick's parents and his sister, the 1990s were not a time of economic boom or cultural shift. They were a continuation of the nightmare. Every birthday was a wound reopened. Every Christmas was a reminder of the empty chair. They watched the news, seeing other crimes solved, other families receiving justice, and they asked the heavens, why not us? They maintained a vigil of memory, ensuring that Rick was not reduced to a statistic in a dusty ledger. Then came the year 2009. The Ottawa County Sheriff's Office, recognizing that time was the enemy of truth, established a cold case team. These were not rookies looking to make a name for themselves. These were veterans, seasoned investigators who understood the patience required to hunt a ghost. They dusted off the boxes. They scanned the faded crime scene photographs into modern computers. They reread the handwritten notes of their predecessors, looking for the pattern that had been missed. They turned to the evidence locker. Inside, among the physical remnants of 1987, were the swabs taken from the car. Science had leaped forward. Now they could do more than just identify blood type. They could look at the very building blocks of life. They sent the samples to the laboratory, their hearts held in a collective suspension of hope. The results returned. There was DNA, a profile, a genetic fingerprint of the man who had stood in that driveway. It was a moment of triumph, a surge of adrenaline that electrified the department. They had him. They had the code that defined the killer. All they needed to do was run it through the Codius database, the combined DNA index system, and a name would pop up on the screen. The arrest would happen before dinner. But the screen remained blank. No match found. The killer was not in the system. He had never been arrested for a felony. He was not a career criminal whose DNA was on file. He was a clean skin, a man who lived within the boundaries of the law, except for those few seconds of brutal violence on a November night. The triumph turned to ash. They had the lock, but they did not have the key. The DNA profile became just another piece of paper, a string of numbers and letters that represented a monster without a face. Ask yourself, how does one find a man who does not exist in the eyes of the law? How do you catch a phantom who pays his taxes, mows his lawn, and waves to his neighbors, all while carrying the secret of a murder in his heart? The investigation stalled again. The years between 2009 and 2014 were a period of technological purgatory. The detectives knew the answer was there, hidden in the double helix, but they lacked the map to read it. They looked at that DNA profile and saw only a dead end. But in the wider world, a revolution was brewing. Not in police stations, but in the living rooms of amateur genealogists. People were spitting into tubes to find out if they were Irish or Italian. They were building family trees online, connecting with third cousins they had never met. They were creating a massive, decentralized database of humanity's genetic history. And quietly, brilliant minds began to ask a dangerous question. What if we could use this database not to find long-lost relatives, but to find long-lost killers? It was a controversial idea. It walked the fine line of privacy and ethics. But for the cold case team in Ottawa County, ethics were weighed against the image of a grieving mother who had waited 30 years for an answer. They decided to take the leap. They decided to employ a technique that was still in its experimental phase, a technique that would eventually become known as investigative genetic genealogy. They contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a company at the forefront of this new frontier. They sent the DNA profile, the only physical piece of the killer they possessed, to the scientists in Virginia. The request was simple, yet impossibly complex. Tell us who this man is. The scientists did not look for the killer directly. They knew he wouldn't be in the ancestry databases. Instead, they looked for his shadow. They looked for people who shared small segments of DNA with him. Second cousins. Third cousins once removed. People who had no idea that their genetic curiosity would become the net that ensnared a murderer. Imagine the tedious, painstaking work that followed. A genetic genealogist sitting in a quiet room, staring at a screen filled with names and dates. Building trees backwards from distant relatives, looking for the intersection where the branches met. It was like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a beach by analyzing the rocks nearby. They found a cluster of relatives. The focus narrowed. The search moved from the abstract world of genetics to the concrete world of geography. They needed a male who was in Michigan in 1987, a male who would have been the right age. The list of thousands of potential suspects was whittled down to hundreds, then to dozens, and then a name emerged. Not a criminal, not a known violent offender, just a name on a census record, a name on a high school yearbook, a name that meant nothing to the detectives, yet meant everything. But a name is not a conviction. You cannot arrest a man based on a probability calculated by an algorithm. You need confirmation. You need to match the DNA from the crime scene to the DNA of the man walking the streets today. And to do that, you need to get close. You need to invade his world without him knowing. You need to become a shadow yourself. The detectives began a surveillance operation that felt less like police work and more like hunting. They watched his house. They watched his movements. They needed something he had discarded. A coffee cup, a straw, a piece of chewing gum, anything that contained the cells of his body. They had to be patient. If they moved too soon, if they spooked him, he could lawyer up, destroy evidence, or disappear. They followed him to restaurants. They followed him to his workplace. They waited for the moment when he would lower his guard. And finally, the moment came. Not in a dark alley, but in the mundane setting of a public space. An object was discarded. A piece of trash to him, but a diamond to the detectives. They retrieved it with the care of archaeologists handling a holy relic. They rushed it to the lab. The waiting began again. This was the final hurdle. If this DNA matched the DNA found on Rick Brink's car, the mystery of 37 years would evaporate in an instant. If it did not, they were back to square one, staring at a blank wall while a killer laughed in the dark. But the forest of genetic markers had one more twist to reveal. The man they were tracking ... was he the one? Or was he merely another innocent branch on a rotten tree? The results came back. The match was ... consistent. But in the world of high-stakes prosecution, consistent is a dangerous word. It is not definitive. We must pause here and consider the psychological toll on the detectives. To be so close, to feel the heat of the truth, and yet to be held back by the rigorous standards of the law. They needed more. They needed to be absolute. And to get that absolute certainty, they would have to employ a ruse. They would have to look the killer in the eye and lie to him, hoping that in his arrogance he would reveal the truth. Deceit is the currency of the criminal, but patience is the currency of the righteous. For 32 years, the individual responsible for the execution of Richard Brink had been spending his currency freely, purchasing a life of normalcy that he did not deserve. He likely believed that the ledger had been closed, that the debt would never be collected. He was mistaken. The detectives, armed with the silent testimony of genetics, were about to foreclose on his freedom. The date was November 2019. The location, a laboratory where the sterile hum of refrigeration units masked the profound magnitude of the work being conducted. The sample procured from the suspect's discarded refuse, a mundane object, perhaps a coffee cup or a used napkin, had been processed. The comparison was made against the biological material preserved from the 1987 crime scene. The result was not merely a probability. It was a mathematical certainty. The odds of this DNA belonging to another individual were 1 in quintillions. It was a bullseye in a game of darts played across 3 decades. The phantom finally had a face. His name was Dennis Bowman. To the residents of Allegan County, Dennis Bowman was not a monster. He was a neighbor. He was a father. He was a man who tinkered in his workshop, who mowed his lawn, who complained about the weather. He was 70 years old. His hair had grayed, his gait had slowed, and the fire of youth had dimmed in his eyes. He wore the camouflage of the elderly, a disguise that screams harmlessness. Who suspects a grandfather of being a cold-blooded executioner? But this is the banality of evil that philosophers speak of. We expect our villains to have horns, to live in dark towers, to exude an aura of malice. In reality, they shop at the same grocery stores as we do. They stand behind us in line, buying milk and bread. Their hands, the same hands that pulled the trigger counting out change with mundane precision. However, a chilling detail emerged from the depths of Bowman's history, a detail that the detectives uncovered as they built their dossier. This was not a man with a spotless past. There were whispers in the archives, previous encounters with the law, assault, burglary. He was a predator who had learned to navigate the edges of the legal system, a man who knew how to wear the mask of sanity just tight enough to pass inspection. The detectives of the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office now faced a critical tactical decision. They had the DNA. They knew he was their man. But an arrest is a volatile chemical reaction. If handled improperly, it can result in silence. They did not just want a conviction. They wanted the truth. They wanted to know why. Why Rick Brink? Why that night? Why, for 32 years, did he let a family suffer in the purgatory of the unknown? They decided to approach him not with a SWAT team kicking down the door, but with the quiet, terrifying weight of inevitability. Imagine the scene. A quiet morning in rural Michigan. The frost is on the pumpkins. Dennis Bowman is perhaps finishing his breakfast, unaware that the universe is about to correct a 3-decade-old error. He sees a vehicle pull into his driveway. Not a friend, not a delivery driver. It is the constabulary. Ask yourself, what goes through the mind of a man who has held a dark secret for half a lifetime when the past finally knocks on his door? Does his heart rate spike? Does he feel a surge of panic? Or does he feel a strange, twisted sense of relief that the waiting is finally over? The detectives invited him to the station. A conversation. They did not immediately slap the handcuffs on his wrists. They played the game. They wanted to see if he would lie. They wanted to see if the arrogance that allowed him to kill an innocent boy still governed his tone. The interrogation room is a unique theater. It is a space stripped of comfort, designed to strip a man of his defenses. 4 walls, a table, chairs that are never quite comfortable, and the silence. The silence in an interrogation room is not empty. It is heavy. It is filled with the ghosts of the victims. Detective Lieutenant Jeremy Baum and his colleagues sat across from the 70-year-old man. They began softly. They talked about his life. They talked about the area. And then they began to circle. They brought up 1987. They brought up the name Richard Brink. Observe the body language. The shifting in the seat, the dryness of the mouth, the way the eyes dart to the corner of the room, looking for an exit that does not exist. Bowman was a man accustomed to control, but in this room, he was the prey. They showed him the photograph of Rick, the high school graduation photo where Rick looks out with that eternal optimism. "Do you recognize this young man, Dennis?" He denied it. Of course, he denied it. The denial is the last refuge of the guilty. He claimed ignorance. He claimed he was never there. He spun a web of fabrication, believing that his age and his harmless grandfather act would protect him. He did not know that the detectives were holding a royal flush. Then came the moment of the dagger, the moment the detectives stopped asking and started telling. "Dennis, we know you were there. We don't think you were there. We know." They placed the DNA evidence on the table. It was not a weapon, but it hit with the force of a bullet. The science does not lie. The science does not forget. The science placed Dennis Bowman inside that car, inches away from Rick Brink, at the moment of his death. The transformation in the room was palpable. The air left the space. The mask of a kindly old man began to crack, revealing the cold, unfeeling stone beneath. But even then, there was no tearful confession. There was no falling to the knees. There was only the stubborn, stony silence of a man who had spent a lifetime justifying his own sins. The arrest was formalized. The handcuffs, cold and steel, clicked around the wrists of the 70-year-old. It was a sound that echoed through history, a sound that should have been heard in 1987. News of the arrest hit the community of Holland like a shockwave. Michigan 1987 cold case solved. The headline screamed the victory, but the text beneath told a more complex story. The arrest of Dennis Bowman was not just the closing of a case. It was the opening of a Pandora's box. Because when you catch a predator who has been operating in the shadows for decades, you have to ask the terrifying question: was Rick Brink his only victim? Or was Rick simply one chapter in a much longer, much darker book? As the community grappled with the shock, another family, miles away, felt a chill run down their spines. A family that had also lost a child. A family that had known Dennis Bowman not as a stranger, but as a father figure. The arrest of Dennis Bowman for the murder of Rick Brink was about to unravel a mystery that was even more personal and even more grotesque. But before we descend into that second circle of hell, we must return to the Brink family. For 32 years, they had waited. Rick's parents had passed away without seeing this day. They died with the question, "Who?" on their lips. Now, only his sister remained to receive the answer. How does one process such news? Is it joy? No. Joy is for weddings and births. This was a grim satisfaction, a validation that their pain was real, that their loss mattered. But it was also a reopening of the wound. To know the killer brings him back into your life. It gives the ghost a body. And as the constabulary prepared their case for trial, they knew that Dennis Bowman would not go quietly. He would fight. He would use every legal maneuver available. He would try to take his secrets to the grave. But the detectives had one more card to play. A card involving a missing daughter, a backyard garden, and a secret buried beneath the earth. When the handcuffs clicked around Dennis Bowman's wrists in November 2019, society exhaled a collective sigh of relief. It appeared that the malice which had lurked in the shadows for 32 years had finally been caged. However, few realized that this arrest was not the final chord, but merely the overture to a symphony of horror that would chill the blood of even the most hardened investigators. For Dennis Bowman harbored another secret, a secret not lying on the surface like a shell casing on asphalt, but buried deep within the earth, both literally and metaphorically. Let us transport ourselves back in time, not to the 19th century, but to the year 1989. 2 years had elapsed since the execution of Richard Brink. Dennis Bowman, having evaded justice, continued to live his life. In his residence, situated in the rural landscape of Allegan County, a teenage girl was coming of age. Her name was Aundria. Aundria Bowman was not Dennis's biological daughter. She had entered this world as Alexis, but was adopted by Dennis and his wife, Brenda, in infancy. To the external world, this appeared as an act of benevolence, a couple taking in a child to provide her with a home and affection. But ask yourself, what if the home is not a sanctuary, but a penitentiary where the warden is the man you are compelled to call father? Aundria was 14 years of age, a tumultuous age, an age of rebellion, self-discovery, and fragile vulnerability. On the 11th of March, 1989, she vanished. She simply dissolved into the cold air of early spring. Dennis and Brenda contacted the authorities, but observe how they did it. They did not speak of abduction. They did not plead for assistance. They affixed a label to a 14-year-old girl that, in the police stations of the 1980s, was tantamount to invisibility. They labeled her runaway. She stole money, Dennis claimed. She was a troubled child. She simply ran off. In that era, the term runaway acted as a sedative on law enforcement. If a teenager ran away, it was deemed a domestic matter, not a crime. There was no Amber Alert system. There were no massive search operations. The case of Aundria Bowman was filed away, gathered dust, and was forgotten. Society concluded she was out there somewhere, living her life, perhaps in California or Florida, attempting to find her place under the sun. But the truth was far more sinister. The truth was that Aundria had never left the perimeter of her home. Return to 2019. The detectives of Ottawa County, celebrating their victory in the Richard Brink case, began to dig deeper into the biography of their suspect. And when they stumbled upon the name Aundria, a tumbler clicked in their minds. Consider the probability. What are the odds that a man who cold-bloodedly shot a teenager in 1987 would, 2 years later, simply lose his adopted daughter? Coincidences of this magnitude do not exist in criminal psychology. There are only patterns that we fail to immediately perceive. The investigators realized they held a unique lever of pressure. Dennis Bowman was already captured for the murder of Rick Brink. The DNA did not lie. He faced life imprisonment. His life, as he knew it, was over. He was 70 years old. He had nothing to lose, except, perhaps, the remnants of control over the narrative. The detectives decided to engage in a perilous psychological game. They began to press on his weakest point. Not his conscience sociopaths lack one. They pressed on his ego and his desire to shield his wife. Brenda Bowman, the mother, the woman who had lived with this man for decades. Did she know? Was she an accomplice, a victim of Stockholm Syndrome, or simply blind, refusing to see the darkness in her own bedroom? Dennis Bowman sat in his cell. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of a concrete box. The detectives visited him repeatedly. They did not ask about Rick. That case was resolved. They asked about Aundria. Where is she, Dennis? We know she did not run away. Tell us where she is, and perhaps we will leave Brenda alone. It was a bluff and the truth simultaneously. The investigators understood that Brenda could be the key. If Dennis wished to spare her from prison or disgrace, he needed to speak. And so, in February 2020, the ice broke. Dennis Bowman, a man who had remained silent for 30 years, began to speak. But what he recounted was not merely a confession to murder. It was a tale of the betrayal of the most sacred trust in human relationships, the trust between parent and child. He began to spin a narrative not of running away, but of conflict, of that day in March 1989. He admitted that an altercation had occurred between him and Aundria. But the devil is in the details. He attempted to frame it as an accident, a situation that spiraled out of control. But we, the listeners who understand the nature of darkness, know this. When an adult male kills a child and conceals the body, it is never an accident. It is always a choice. Dennis indicated the location. Not a distant forest, not the bottom of a lake. He pointed to his own backyard, the home they had moved to later in Allegan County. Visualize this grotesque image. A man lives in a house, drinks his morning coffee, looks out the window at his garden, knowing that beneath the layer of turf and soil lie the remains of the girl he promised to protect. He walked on that ground for years. He mowed the grass over her grave. This is a level of cold-bloodedness that is incomprehensible to the normal mind. The police and forensic anthropologists arrived at the specified location. The exhumation began. It was a slow, painstaking process. Layer by layer, they removed the earth, peeling back the shroud of lies with which Dennis had covered himself for decades. And they found her. Aundria Bowman returned from oblivion. Skeletal remains. Silent witnesses to the horror that had transpired 31 years ago. But this discovery spawned an even more terrifying question. Why? Why Richard Brink? Why Aundria Bowman? What invisible thread connected these two crimes? The answer lay in the dark proclivities of Dennis Bowman. The investigation began to lance the boil of his past. It became clear that Dennis possessed a history of violence. The murder of Rick Brink, that innocent boy in the car, was not a random act of rage. Was it a rehearsal? Or did Rick simply find himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, becoming a target for a predator on the prowl? However, with Aundria, the evil was far more intimate. Detectives suspected, and facts began to corroborate, that Aundria had discovered the dark side of her adoptive father. Perhaps she threatened to expose his secrets? Perhaps she had grown too old, too independent, and he decided that the only way to maintain control was to destroy the object of that control. Now, the prosecutors faced the task of not only convicting a killer, but weaving these cases into a singular tapestry of evil. Dennis Bowman, the quiet retiree, was revealed to be a serial killer operating with vast intervals of time. He was a chameleon who changed his colors to blend into the scenery. But the greatest blow was yet to come. Dennis Bowman, from behind bars, began to play his own game. He confessed to Aundria's murder, hoping that this admission might somehow mitigate his fate in the Rick Brink case or save his wife from prosecution. But he failed to account for one thing. Justice is a machine that, once ignited, grinds everything in its path. And what of Brenda, the woman who called herself Aundria's mother? What was her role in this tragedy? Did she know her husband had killed their daughter and buried her in the backyard? Or did she choose to believe the convenient lie of the runaway to avoid shattering her fragile world? This is the question that haunts us most. For evil thrives not only on the actions of monsters, but on the silence of those who stand beside them. A confession is rarely the unburdening of a soul seeking redemption. More often, it is a strategic maneuver, a final attempt by the narcissist to control the narrative when all other avenues of escape have been sealed. Dennis Bowman did not confess because he felt the weight of guilt. He confessed because the walls of evidence had closed in, leaving him no room to maneuver. In the sterile confines of the interrogation room, Bowman provided the details of Aundria's demise. He spoke of an argument. He claimed she had been disrespectful. He painted a picture of a father pushed to the brink by a rebellious teenager. But listen closely to the cadence of his voice. It was the voice of a man minimizing his monstrosity. He admitted to striking her, to causing her to fall down the stairs. A tragic accident, he called it. But forensic science is deaf to the excuses of killers. The examination of the remains found in the shallow grave told a different story, a story of brutal force and a callous disregard for human life. And then the ultimate act of desecration, the concealment. Imagine the psychological architecture of a man who can kill a child, place her in a container, and bury her beneath the very ground where he would later host family barbecues. For years, he looked out at that patch of earth. Did he see his daughter? Or did he simply see a problem that he had successfully solved? This ability to compartmentalize, to separate the monster from the man mowing the lawn, is the defining trait of the true psychopath. But the horror did not stop at the grave. As investigators peeled back the layers of Bowman's life, a disturbing question arose regarding the connection between the two victims. Richard Brink, the clean-cut factory worker, and Aundria Bowman, the vulnerable adopted daughter. On the surface, they shared nothing but their tragic ends and their killer. But in the twisted mind of Dennis Bowman, they were likely connected by a singular, dark drive. The prosecution began to formulate a theory. Rick Brink was killed in 1987. Aundria disappeared in 1989. 2 years. A cooling-off period? Or was Rick the escalation point? Had Bowman been fantasizing about violence, and was Rick the test subject for his lethal impulses? Some theories suggested that Rick might have seen something he wasn't supposed to. Perhaps he had crossed paths with Bowman in a way that threatened Bowman's carefully constructed facade. But the more likely, and more terrifying, truth is that Rick was simply a vessel for Bowman's rage. A crime of opportunity. A moment where the predator saw a gazelle separated from the herd and struck. With Aundria, the motive was darker, steeped in the dynamics of power and control within the home. As she grew older, as she began to assert her independence, she became a threat to Bowman's dominance. And in his world, threats are not managed. They are eliminated. The legal proceedings that followed were a labyrinth of motions and hearings. Dennis Bowman, despite his confession, was a slippery adversary. He played games with the court. He tried to suppress the evidence. He tried to withdraw his statements. He was an animal caught in a trap, gnawing at his own leg to get free. But the evidence was a mountain that could not be moved. The DNA in the Brink case was irrefutable. The body in the backyard in the Aundria case was a silent scream that drowned out his lies. And amidst this legal storm stood the families. The Brink family, finally seeing the face of the man who stole their son, and the biological mother of Aundria Bowman. Yes, Aundria had a birth mother, a woman who had given her up for adoption, hoping for a better life for her child, only to discover decades later that she had handed her daughter to a monster. Kathy Turkanian, Aundria's birth mother, became a force of nature. She had spent years looking for the daughter she gave up, only to find a cold case. She had fought, clawed, and screamed for answers when the police had given up. To her, Dennis Bowman was not just a killer. He was the thief of a future she had dreamed of for her child. The courtroom became the arena where these two worlds collided. The stoic, grief-stricken Brink family and the fiery, relentless Kathy Turkanian. Two different expressions of loss, united by a single perpetrator. As the trial date approached, the community of Michigan braced itself. They were about to hear the full extent of the depravity that had lived in their midst. They were about to look into the abyss. But before the gavel could fall, Dennis Bowman had one more card to play, a plea deal. An agreement that would spare the families the trauma of a lengthy trial. But at what cost? Is justice truly served if the details are buried in a plea agreement? Or is it a necessary compromise to ensure the monster never breathes free air again? The stage was set for the final act. A 70-year-old man, frail in appearance but wrought in spirit, standing before a judge to answer for crimes spanning 3 decades. The ghosts of Richard Brink and Aundria Bowman filled the courtroom, demanding to be heard. Ask yourself, does a life sentence mean anything to a man who has already lived a full life? Is prison a punishment, or merely a nursing home with bars? The courtroom is a theater of tragedy, disguised as a hall of order. It is a place where raw, bleeding emotion is forced into the rigid geometry of legal procedure. In February of 2022, the Allegan County Courthouse became the stage for the final act of a play that had been. running in the shadows for 32 years. Dennis Bowman was wheeled into the room. Observe this visual. The predator who had stalked the night, the man who had strangled a daughter and executed a stranger, was now a frail, crumbling figure in a wheelchair. This is the ultimate deception of time. It disguises the wolf in the wool of infirmity. It begs the jury for sympathy, whispering, "Look at this old man. How could he be a monster?" But the eyes of Kathy Turkanian, Aundria's birth mother, saw through the disguise. She did not see a grandfather. She saw the thief of her bloodline. The plea deal had been struck. For the murder of Aundria Bowman, Dennis pleaded no contest to second-degree murder. In exchange, the additional charge of mutilation of a body was dropped. It was a transaction, a cold calculation. 35 to 50 years in prison. For a 72-year-old man, it was a life sentence by another name. But for a mother, 35 years felt like a discount on a soul. Kathy Turkanian stood. She was the voice of the girl buried in the backyard. She looked at the man who had adopted her child only to destroy her. "You are a monster," she declared, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the seismic force of repressed rage. "You threw her away like trash." Bowman sat impassive. His face was a mask of indifference. He did not weep. He did not look down in shame. He simply existed, a void where a conscience should have been. This lack of affect is the mark of the beast in criminal psychology. It is the chilling realization that to him, Aundria was not a person. She was an object that had malfunctioned and was discarded. But let us not forget the other ghost in the room, Richard Brink. While the Aundria Bowman case was being resolved with a plea, the Richard Brink case demanded a different kind of reckoning. Here, the charge was first-degree murder, premeditated, cold, calculated. The evidence against Bowman in the Brink case was purely scientific, yet the narrative was purely human. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who, in 1987, was a ticking time bomb of violence. They argued that Rick Brink was a victim of Bowman's hunting. Bowman's defense was feeble. "I didn't do it," is a hard argument to make when your genetic code is stamped on the victim's car like a signature. The judge's voice cut through the air. For the murder of Richard Brink, life in prison without the possibility of parole. 2 sentences. One for the daughter he betrayed, one for the stranger he slaughtered. Finally, the scales of justice, rusted by decades of neglect, groaned into balance. But as the bailiffs wheeled Dennis Bowman away, a man now destined to die in a concrete cage, a disturbing question lingered in the minds of everyone present. A question that transformed this from a closed case into a lingering nightmare. We know who he killed. We know how he killed. But we still do not fully understand why he stopped. Did he stop? Serial killers rarely retire. They do not simply wake up one day and decide to suppress the urge to kill. They are forced to stop by death, by incarceration, or by infirmity. Dennis Bowman was free from 1989 until 2019. 30 years. Are we to believe that a man capable of shooting a boy in the face and burying his daughter in the yard simply lived a pious, nonviolent life for 3 decades? Or are there other secrets, other runaways, other cold cases scattered across the Midwest that bear his invisible fingerprint? The constabulary is not finished. They are looking. They are reviewing the files of missing women in every county where Bowman lived or worked. The NOR algorithmist knows that in the real world, unlike in fiction, there are rarely neat endings. There are only chapters that are closed, and chapters that remain terrifyingly open. Now, turn your attention to the collateral damage. The debris field left in the wake of the predator. We must speak of Brenda Bowman, the wife, the woman who shared his bed, the woman who lived in the house where Aundria was buried. Throughout the trial, she remained an enigma. She was not charged. The law could not prove she knew. But ask yourself, as you sit in the safety of your home, could you live with a murderer for 40 years and not sense the darkness? Could you watch your husband mow the lawn over your daughter's grave and truly believe she was in California? This is the psychological horror that lingers. The possibility of willful blindness. The idea that we see what we want to see because the truth is too shattered to bear. Brenda is now left alone in that house. Or perhaps she has moved, but she can never move away from the question that the world asks her silently every day. How could you not know? As we approach the conclusion of this dark chronicle, we must prepare for the final analysis. We have the facts. We have the verdict. But we have yet to extract the meaning. In the next file, we will dissect the specific dagger that killed the beast, the technology itself, and we will offer the intellectual satisfaction of understanding exactly how the trap was sprung. And finally, we will leave you with a moral dilemma that will haunt your sleep. Justice is often depicted as a blind woman holding a sword, but in the 21st century, justice wears a lab coat and holds a pipette. The resolution of the Rick Brink and Aundria Bowman cases was not achieved through a confession wrung out in a smoky room, nor by a witness suddenly recovering their memory. It was achieved by the relentless, unblinking eye of science. Let us deconstruct the dagger that finally pierced the armor of Dennis Bowman. For decades, criminal investigation was limited by the direct match paradigm. You found blood. You extracted DNA. You checked it against a database of known criminals, CODIS. If the killer had never been arrested before, he was invisible. He was a ghost. This was the flaw that allowed men like Bowman to walk free. He was careful. He was clean in the eyes of the system. But Investigative Genetic Genealogy, IGG, changed the geometry of the hunt. It introduced the concept of the genetic web. When Parabon Nanolabs received the degraded DNA sample from the 1987 crime scene, they did not look for Dennis Bowman. They looked for his blood. They uploaded the profile to public genealogy databases, GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA. These are repositories where ordinary people, searching for their heritage, unknowingly build a trap for the wicked. The algorithm found a match. Not Dennis, but a second cousin. A person who shared approximately 3% of their DNA with the killer. Think about that. 3%. A tiny fraction of a human genome. But it was enough. From that 3%, the genealogists built a tree in reverse. They identified the common ancestors' great-grandparents who had died in the early 20th century. Then they moved forward in time, tracing every branch, every marriage, every child. They built a massive map of a family, pruning branches that didn't fit the profile. Wrong age, wrong location, wrong gender. Finally, the tree narrowed to a single branch. A single household in Allegan County. The Bowman family. This is the intellectual satisfaction we promised. The realization that every decision Bowman made to hide his crime was rendered useless by the biology of his distant relatives. He could burn clothes. He could bury bodies. But he could not scrub his genetic code from the cousins he had never met. Now, recall the Chekhov's gun we placed in the first act, the maroon Chevrolet Impala. In 1987, witnesses saw a dark car. Bowman owned a maroon Impala. He sold it shortly after the murder. For 30 years, this fact was just a line in a DMV record. But when the DNA pointed to Bowman, that car became the corroborating anchor. It was the physical manifestation of his guilt that aligned perfectly with the biological evidence. And what of the call to action we made about the wife, Brenda? The legal system did not charge her. But the court of public opinion is not bound by the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. The narrative leaves us with an open loop, a scandal ending for this subplot. Did she negotiate her own immunity in exchange for allowing the search of the backyard? Or was she truly the ultimate victim of deception? This ambiguity is essential to the noir style. We do not tie every thread into a neat bow. We leave some fraying, because life is frayed. The image of Brenda, living in the shadow of a double murderer, serves as a reminder that the radius of a crime extends far beyond the victim. It poisons the soil, the house, and the souls of those who remain. The conviction of Dennis Bowman sent a shockwave through the cold case community. It proved that perfect crimes have an expiration date. It proved that the past is never truly dead. It is merely waiting to be sequenced. But as we prepare for our final descent, a heavy realization settles in. Science solved the who and the how, but it can never truly solve the loss. Rick Brink never got to be a father. He never saw the internet or the fall of the Berlin Wall. He remains 18 forever. Aundria Bowman never went to prom. She never traveled. She remains 14 forever, a skeleton in the hard earth. Dennis Bowman stole approximately 100 years of life from these two souls. Does a life sentence balance that ledger? In the final file, we will not just conclude the story. We will challenge you. We will place the moral weight of this tragedy on your shoulders and ask you to carry it into the comments section. We will transform this passive viewing experience into an active debate on the nature of evil and the sufficiency of justice. We have traversed the dark chronology of 3 decades. We have witnessed the extinguishing of Richard Brink's bright future in a driveway and the gruesome concealment of Aundria Bowman's youth in a backyard grave. We have watched as the arrogance of a predator was dismantled by the silent, unyielding helix of DNA. Now the ledger is closed. Dennis Bowman has been sentenced. He will die in prison. The state of Michigan considers this case resolved. But I ask you to look closer at the mathematics of this justice. Richard Brink was denied approximately 60 years of life. Aundria Bowman was denied perhaps 70. That is 130 years of human experience, love, heartbreak, achievement, failure, stolen by one man. And what is the price he pays? Dennis Bowman lived free until his 70s. He experienced the churn of the millennium. He tasted food, felt the sun, and slept in a warm bed for 11,000 days after he pulled that trigger. His punishment is merely the forfeiture of his final declining years. Is this true equilibrium? Or is it a cosmic joke? This narrative forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of cold case justice. We celebrate the technological marvel of investigative genetic genealogy. We applaud the tenacity of the detectives, and rightly so. They are the alchemists who turn dust into truth. But for the families, the victory is Pyrrhic. A prison sentence does not unpull a trigger. It does not exhume a daughter and breathe life back into her lungs. It merely validates the grief that they have carried alone for a lifetime. However, there is a silver lining in this storm clouds. The capture of Dennis Bowman sends a frequency into the ether that every dormant killer hears. It tells them that the concept of getting away with it is obsolete. It tells them that their secrets are not safe in the ground, nor are they safe in their own blood. As we conclude this broadcast, I leave you with the burden of the verdict. The law says justice has been served. But if you were the architect of the universe, would you accept this exchange? Does a life sentence for an old man balance the scales for 2 young lives? Or should there be a different kind of reckoning for those who hide in plain sight? I invite you to step into the jury box of the comments section. Do not merely watch, participate. Tell me, was justice served, or was it merely delayed until it lost its meaning? This has been a chronicle of the shadows. The world is vast, and the night is deep, but as we have seen, even the darkest secrets eventually find the light. Until we meet again for the next inquiry into the human condition, remain vigilant, watch the shadows, and kindly ensure you are subscribed, for the next dossier is already being opened.